The world around is changing. We can deny the facts all we want, but if we don't change our ways soon, the extinction of mankind is on the horizon. Let me pause for a moment to offer introductions. My name is Professor Angelina Gamble, and for the past 15 years, I've studied climate change, ecological diversity, and biochemistry, along with a master's in history and archaeology. Right now, it is my duty to tell others about our environmental responsibilities. But I have to do more than just that. I have to make a change for the better. My father instilled in me a love for this planet, and I will use my dying breath to give humans a fighting chance. Unfortunately, another grim truth is money makes the world go round in this day and age. If you don't have the funds, the research quickly dries up. This happened almost 30 years ago with my father in the Andes. He was on the verge of a breakthrough with a new type of power source that could make fossil fuels obsolete. And then when the headmaster changed, the interest in climate was gone as well as all of the research was lost. I fought for the last 10 years to regain a foothold on that research. It seemed nearly impossible, but I never gave up hope. Working right alongside my old man at the university and pushing for larger budgets, new grants, and different opportunities to make it all happen. That hope finally paid off about 2 weeks ago, when Dad walked in with a check from the new headmaster. Once again, politics changed the views of those in charge, but we weren't complaining because the number was more than we ever dreamed of. $1,900,300. My mouth literally dropped when I saw the number. I think I checked it 10 times. My father trying his best not to have a stroke. The reason for our excitement was also personal. My mother lost her life trying to uncover the properties of previously never discovered minerals in the high mountains near the borders of Colombia and Ecuador. The cave-in that killed her, and the rest of her team being the nail in the coffin for her future digs. At last, we were on the verge of proving her theories and helping to curb our carbon footprint, and it was thrilling. There was so much to prepare. Heavy machinery to buy, a team to assemble, and then supplies. The list felt endless. My father did his best to keep me calm. It doesn't matter if it takes months to get things up and running now. As long as we have that money, we have everything we need, he reassured me. I relied on him heavily to contact the different specialists that we would have to have. Even though the site was relatively still intact, I knew it would be far more difficult than simply returning to South America and setting up camp. The region near the excavation is a harsh one. The temperatures can range from drastic dry heat to sub-zero within miles of each other. With winding valleys and uncharted jungles that often turn into war zones for guerrilla armies covering the majority of the surrounding area, simply getting there was half the battle. In fact, it was obvious that trekking by land would not be an option. Most, if not all, of the trails available were only large enough for wildlife, and hardly suitable for the supplies that we would need to bring. An airdrop into the mountains was the only solution that we could think of, and that of course was where our first major expense went. Besides that, the facility itself was small and run down, not designed to house more than 10 or 12 individuals at a time. It was old and dangerous and poorly put together, lacking proper piping, air circulation, and other modern commodities. So, those who did come needed to be given certain reassurances that the journey was worth it. And by that I mean, of course, that they would need to be financially compensated in a large way. Monthly salaries cut into my budget quickly. We had to pay for labor to clear the dig site, to prepare the facility with some running water, electricity, and temperature control. By the time Dad and I had arrived, only 30% of it was up and ready to go. The rest was literally covered by an encroaching mess of vines that had threatened to make the building collapse at any moment. But we were not deterred. The people Dad had found had the right attitude, often working long hours to push into the core of the mountain. Usually because of the bad weather, they could only do so much before the equipment malfunctioned. But still, they kept going with shovels and pickaxes. The desolation around us would not stop our progress. Norman, the crewmaster, would often sing songs from his home country to muster the others to keep going. Anything to keep them sane. The weather made it difficult to determine what hours were passing, and often the drastic changes made us paranoid and feeling uneasy. But finally, we reached the areas my mom had theorized would lead to a pocket of earth never touched by man. I could see where the cavern had collapsed and likely killed her and all the others, leaving nothing but rubble in its wake. Dad told Norman's men to stop working for a moment, as we took a moment of silence for her and the others. The room seemed filled with death. I could even hear distant screams in my mind, as I thought of Mom and how she had likely suffocated where I was now standing. It left me numb, terrified to think the same fate could befall us. But we didn't come here to simply stop here, and so the dig began. The team would sometimes work into the long hours of the night, using the backhoe until it couldn't run any longer, and hauling out mounds of dirt and clay. Each new push into the mountains felt like it took a lifetime, but my dad kept reminding me of the fact that we were finally here. We are so close, Angelia. This is going to be history in the making. It took us almost 2 weeks to finally reach the next antechamber of the cavern. A wide pocket of stones and molten lava that seemed almost carved by ancient people. At last, we could go in by foot. Dad led the way, using a light on his safety helmet to peer into the gloom. The atmosphere was icy. A pocket of the world, never even aware of the world beyond. It made me feel like we were entering a forbidden realm, something not meant for mortal eyes. The air in here hasn't been breathed in likely over 600 years or more, Dad whispered. Behind us, the excavation crew followed, carrying lanterns and pickaxes. Our professional photographer, Dominic Legray, paused to capture every nook and cranny. This is freaky, he commented as we rounded every corner. We saw no signs of life in the cavern either, just more and more of the same bland decay, like something had eaten away at the very earth. Even as his flashes struck against the walls, it still felt surreal. We were here, and ready to begin discoveries that could alter history. But everything we were searching for now seemed suddenly gone. Only one of these smaller machines, a drill, could fit into the next tunnel. Norman and his second in command, a man named Emmanuel, took turns getting it deeper into the molten core. Phosphorus chemicals filled the air and all of us quickly covered our mouths. Manuel began to cough and spit up blood, unable to cover his mouth quickly enough. Dr. Howlett, Nurse Ornan, we'll need medical down here, Dad said into the radio as we pulled the man back from the smoke. I wanted to actually stop and see whether or not Manuel was alright, but Dad was so focused on the dig and what might lie ahead that I couldn't leave him either. Squeezing through the other side of the narrow passage, we found ourselves standing on a frozen lake of some kind. There's something in the ice, Norman shouted as he shone his light below. Dad took a step forward and looked through the thick sheet of frozen rock, trying to make out what it might be. It looks like a body bag, Norman admitted uneasily. It seemed impossible as I examined it. How could it be here? Maybe it was one of Mom's crew and they made it farther than we thought, I suggested. We don't know until we exhume the corpse, Dad decoded. He radioed our physician again and told them of the situation. Make the main conference chamber into a small morgue if possible. We will bring the preserved sample up right away, he ordered. This doesn't feel right. Look at the way this room was set up. It was sealed off, like we aren't supposed to be here, Norman said. Don't be a superstitious idiot. It's just a corpse. Dad shouted and ordered they begin immediately, or he would dock a week's worth of pay. Needless to say, that was all the motivation they needed. The next few hours we spent chipping away at the ice around the body. As we got closer and closer to the discovery, it became clear that it was not merely a 30-year-old body. No, this was far more ancient. Perhaps from the Incas or other indigenous tribes, I theorized as we began to extract it from the ice. A lost soul forgotten by the passage of time. Once it was within arm's length of me, I could clearly see its features. An overwhelming sense of foreboding came over me. It was hardly recognizable as a person, lacking eyes, nose, or other facial features. Yet its form resembled a petite, middle-aged woman in the fetal position. The cold mummified the body. The organs might be intact, Dad said, noting that the decay had stopped at some point after their burial. It was clear from the way that they had been placed within the ice. Their death had been intentional. Whoever had put them there wanted to make sure that they could not leave. That evening after dinner, Dr. Hollett began a sample study of the body. I hadn't been able to eat a bite, too disturbed by the corpse. Dad, meanwhile, seemed in good spirits, insisting that we be there to observe as I used the basic tools we had at our disposal to take a blood sample from the frozen mummy. With this, we can determine the time of death, and perhaps learn something new about our friend, he explained to me. That sparkle in his eye had me wondering what his intentions were, but I didn't question it. Meanwhile, the team in the caverns below had stopped for the night, too intrigued and terrified by the mummy to do much else. Many of the crew are superstitious. They think this is some kind of curse upon us, Norman explained. Especially now that Manuel seems sick. He hasn't been able to get up since he inhaled those chemicals, the crewmaster added. I scoffed at such nonsense, but the corpse did unsettle me, especially as Dr. Hollett made its features more visible. The Gray stood by, capturing the entire process in vivid detail with his camera. I didn't need something like that to remember. It was scarred into my memory how nightmarish it looked. It was covered in open sores, like some kind of flesh-eating bacteria had ravaged it from head to toe, including its entire chest cavity and face. Drilling into the crooked left arm allowed for a further examination of the bones, told me something else that I had feared, and Hollett said it out loud for all of us to hear. They were alive when they were placed in the pit, he said, examining the sample under a microscope. How barbaric, Dad said in astonishment, the first hint of concern in his voice. Perhaps not. Look at this here, the doctor said, offering him a glance, and then I got a look as well. The slide showed what looked like submicroscopic life moving amid what was left of the bone marrow. As they wriggled and began to circle about the microscope, I felt a chill go up and down my spine. This was a pathogen, a biological weapon, and that meant the reasons for the quick burial were evident. The ancient people had wanted to prevent an infection. Can you determine what this is? I asked Hollett. It'll take some time. I could extract other more viable organs. Despite the cellular decay, it's likely deeper than the body that the virus might have survived, he said. Do it, I told him eagerly. He nodded and returned to the makeshift morgue, gathering his tools and beginning to torch off the remaining sheets of ice. Dad squeezed my hand and neither of us said a thing, too enthralled by what was happening in front of us. We needed to know whether or not we were in danger as well. It didn't take long for the answer to be obvious. As the final pieces of ice melted off, Dr. Hollett took a break and raised the internal temperature of the room, eager to begin a proper autopsy. Seeing the corpse now in fresh light gave me that same uneasy feeling again, realizing how much this strange disease had likely forced the poor soul to suffer. And then out of nowhere, the body jerked. Dr. Hollett screamed in alarm and dropped his surgical tools, the sudden gasp of air from the body enough to paralyze him with fear. Dad and I watched in abject horror as well, amazed by what we saw. The corpse was barely moving, but these signs were obvious. Whatever we had found, it was very much alive. The word quarantine likely sounds all too familiar in this day and age that we live in. I'm sure many of you likely assume that you know everything there is to know about it, but you're wrong. The word takes on an entirely different meaning when you are trapped in the middle of nowhere, with a corpse that is beginning to reanimate. Less than 6 hours after we had discovered that the mummy from the Andes might still have living tissue within it, our administration locked us down and said we needed to await further instructions, and above all else, not leave. Easier said than done. News of the way the body had reacted to Dr. Howlett traveled fast in our group, and even though now the corpse appeared once again dormant, none of us dared go into the same room as it. And besides that, panic was spreading amid the crewmen and even the seasoned scientists. None of us had ever seen anything quite like this. We need to know what we're dealing with, Dad insisted that same evening as we met in the mess hall. It's a demon, a force from beyond our world, Norman said, and his men made mutters of agreement. It wouldn't be long before they staged a coup to leave, I realized. Perhaps it's possible that the microscopic infectious cells have somehow mutated the body and taken hold of it, allowing for a new life form to control the deceased body, I suggested, ignoring their superstitious banter. If we could find a way to prove that the threat was earthly, perhaps more panic could be averted. Or so I thought. But people hardly ever listen to reason when they are facing a crisis, and this situation was hardly any different. For the moment though, my father's insistence that we remain on the opposite side of the building and focus on the dig seemed to have placated their fears. At least they could stay busy in the icy caverns below. Once they had finished their evening meal, unable to sleep, the crewmen traveled to the depths of the mountain again, while Dominic called me aside to examine the photographs that he had managed to take of the mummy. I had thought that I had been able to memorize the details of the nightmarish disease that covered the body, but his pictures had somehow captured them in even more stunning detail. With his camera's focus lens, he could zoom in on the deep wounds, allowing for me to see another dangerous discovery. Fungus, likely the source of the microscopic infection, was slowly growing out of the thousands of holes that covered the corpse. I've seen spores like this before, deep in the Amazon. Dangerous mind-controlling fungi that can control insects to spread their bodies across wide areas of undergrowth. I'm almost positive that this is the same thing, Dad said when he examined the photos. I could sense a wavering doubt in his voice. Was he worried that our journey here might end the same way as Mom's? No, not quite the same thing, but some ancient variant. A dormant gigavirus that we've unintentionally woke up, he admitted as he stared towards the sealed-off room. Every once in a while we could hear the strange, labored breathing of the reanimated corpse. I wondered if it was the fungus, pushing more spores out of the body and causing the lungs to fill up. It was almost impossible to ignore such an ominous sound, but Dad insisted that we keep away. I wish I had listened. The turning point came when I went to check on Manuel. Another of the crewmen, Jarvis, had been sitting with him using cold towels to keep his fever down, but it was clear that he was not doing very well. His body was visibly shaken and his breathing was labored, as though something had infected his lungs. I called for Dr. Howlett to come examine him and see what his condition was, but the doctor was hardly in any condition to assist either. After waiting for 30 minutes for him to arrive, I went to the physician's room and found him passed out, sweating profusely and collapsed on the floor. A look at his arm told me why. A part of his arm where the corpse had slashed at him was now inflamed, swelling, and a deep purplish red. Something was infecting him and causing extreme pain to the poor man. I ran to get some water and I quickly revived him, trying to examine the wounds and see how severe it was, how it had spread so quickly. Howlett opened his eyes, and I could see the pain deep in his soul. He was scared, but he tried to hide it from me. I just got lightheaded, he insisted as I helped him up. I was careful not to place any extra pressure on his swollen arm. Why didn't you report this when you first saw the symptoms? I chided him. I decided it was pointless to try and pretend the situation was anything but severe. We need to treat this immediately, I told him. And do what? Amputation? It won't matter. The virus is spreading fast. It's in my blood, Angie, he shouted. That same fear he had tried to hide was easily resurfacing. If we do nothing, it'll kill you. Better me than all of us, he snapped back. I shook my head, deciding not to bother with the debate. You may think you are self-sacrificing, but Manuel is already sick. His lungs are full of some kind of mutation from the original spores, I think. But I need your help to do a full exam, I said as we left his small bunker. Howlett nodded, gesturing for me to guide him to where Manuel was resting. As we began the exam, Howlett apologized that we didn't have the proper equipment to give the man some kind of sedative. Angelia, tie him down, he instructed, pointing to some clothes nearby that I could fashion as a robe. Are you serious? He can hardly stand. Once I begin, it's likely he'll fight, Howlett told me. I went ahead and got the clothes, tearing them and placing them in Manuel's mouth first in case he began to scream. The only way that I'm going to be able to get a proper sample would be to cut into his lung, the doctor explained as he gathered his surgical tools. His hands were shaking. I was about to second-guess myself and tell him to wait when he made the first slice against Manuel's ribcage. As predicted, the crewman screamed. I did my best to hold him down and told Norman to do the same. He had been standing and watching the entire process without a word. It took all of our efforts to keep Manuel from getting free, as Dr. Howlett continued to scrape away part of his body. And then as he opened up a pocket to get to the king, a sudden burst of those same strange chemicals spotted from his body and hit Howlett. The doctor instantly began to choke. He fell back and dropped his surgical tools, grabbing at his throat as he fell. I stood away, too frightened to know for sure what the spores were doing to him. A moment later, the doctor stopped breathing, and he was gone. I had forgotten all about Manuel. He reared up, hitting me in the side as he began to act like a wild animal. Grabbing at the knife, he sliced it through the air, maniacally defending himself. Don't touch me, do you hear me? He snarled as he backed out of the room. Manuel, you aren't well. We're just trying to help, Norman insisted. I'm getting the heck out of here. None of you are stopping me, Manuel answered, clutching his chest to keep the wound from causing him to lose more blood. He stumbled out of the room and Norman instinctively tried to follow, but I held him back. He can't go far. Even if he left this place, think of where we are, I told him. I moved over to Dr. Howlett's body, checking to see what damage these spores had done. Already, I could see that the strange virus had begun to make his flesh rot and decay at a rapid rate. His smell was gone too, like he had never been alive, but I could still hear labored breathing beneath his chest. It made me shudder to think that he might still be suffocating. Contact my father. We need to move him to the same room as the mummy, I told Norman. The crewman was at a loss for words, still shaken by the last few moments. I was doing my best to keep my composure, but I didn't want anyone to see it. This was a nightmare, but I pulled it together and snapped at the foreman to listen to me. There wasn't a moment to lose. I told Dad everything about the situation with Manuel first. Needless to say, he was furious. He can't leave. What are you thinking, Angelia? What if that virus is airborne? He snarled. Quickly, he checked what limited security access we had and sighed in relief. None of the exits have been activated. He is here somewhere, perhaps hoping to recover before he tries to escape, he said. I'm sorry, I didn't even think, I admitted. He got Dominic and Norman to arrange Howlett's body alongside the mummy as he gave me different orders. Find him and get him here. If he is dying from the same thing these men have, we need to find out why Manuel isn't being affected the same way. It may be a key to our survival, he explained. And then he passed me a small pistol. In case he's hostile, don't hesitate to protect yourself, Dad told me. Given the way that the crewman had just attacked us, I wisely took it and began to search the facility. Mentally, I was doing my best to figure out where Manuel might go. Given how small the building was, there weren't a lot of viable options. Then again, I knew his goal was to get outside, so maybe I needed to start looking in parts of the facility that were not fully functional. I arrived at one of the older hatches that had once led to the observatory and noticed bloody shoe prints, confirming that he had come this way. And then I turned on my smartphone to look through the gloomy stairwell, calling out to him. I didn't expect a response. The abandoned observatory was like a tomb. One of the first places to fall apart thanks to the cave-in years ago. As I carefully stepped over the rubble and pushed through to the outer mountainside, I thought about how these same stones were likely the ones that had killed my mother. We had no way of knowing where her team had met their demise, I thought as I called to Manuel again. A gentle summer rain was misting across the mountains as I carefully followed the ridge up to the next segment of the ruined observatory. There was little else to do but for him to try and scale down. I saw him carefully moving amid the rocks, keeping the surgical knife close to his chest as he tried to find a clear path. "You need to stop before you get hurt," I shouted to him. His wild eyes shot back at me and he shouted some obscenity in his native tongue as he started to run. Somehow, I had expected that response. His fight or flight had kicked in. I broke into a run as well, my heart rapidly pumping as I thought of Dad's warning. The nearest village was over 40 miles away, but who knew if any indigenous tribes were out in the jungle below. Manuel couldn't be allowed to leave. Desperately, I jumped down to the next part of the stairs, the old metal creaking and swaying as I shouted to Manuel. He wasn't listening, but it wasn't just because of me. Something was drowning me out from above. Both of us paused in surprise to hear the noise as it grew louder. At first, panic had set in as I thought it was an avalanche. And then I saw a swarm of dark helicopters pushing their way out of the clouds. It did not make me feel any more at ease as I got a closer look at the men and women that were operating the machines. This was military, and all of them were armed to the teeth. I saw AK-47s, grenades, and knives the size of my arm as the helicopters got closer. One of the men took out a sniper rifle and my heart sank. A long stream of red pierced the dreary air as they locked on to Manuel. I don't remember if I screamed. I know I wanted to. In the midst of the noise and the rain, they fired and the bullet split his face apart. Red splattered out of his forehead as he jerked back for a second like a puppet and then crumpled to the ground. A moment later, long ropes descended to the ground and the soldiers began to shimmy down to where I stood. I was trembling, aghast at the sudden callous regard for the man that they had killed. Had they been aware that he was infected? Or did they just want to make sure that none of us could get out of here? My unspoken question was given an answer a moment later, as one of the officers that had decorated ranks on his uniform stepped forward and pointed a rifle at the body again. "This facility is now under our jurisdiction. Put your hands over your head and get down on the ground." I was herded like I was cattle back into the mess hall, the armed men forcibly blocking all exits as they scouted the entire facility. Dad and Dominic were already there, both looking equally concerned about the unexpected visitors. "Perimeter is secure, sir," one of the younger soldiers told their commanding officer. I was still shaking from having seen them callously cut down Manuel right in front of us. "Who are you?" my dad asked, boldly stepping toward the senior ranking officer. "Professor Gamble, I understand that you have questions, but you mustn't be surprised. The university sent us immediately when we heard of the discovery that you made. My name is George Ackley, Colonel in the United States Army, Private Forces Division. Since when is the university being assisted by the military? I asked. Well, since we deem this site as a possible threat to international security. Ackley answered and then turned towards my father, clearly viewing him as in charge. Where is the mummified corpse, Professor? I would like to see it with my own eyes. I grabbed my dad's arm and muttered, Why should we cooperate with anything they want? You saw what they did to Manuel. They could kill all of us. Ackley's sharp eyes zeroed in on me again. And we still could if we saw that the virus was continuing to spread amongst the population here. But we are not barbarians. We will assess the situation first and then determine the best way to proceed. He snapped back as he turned to my father and raised a curious eyebrow. Besides, if you want to be technical, you did ask for our assistance when you contacted Headmaster Schwartz, he remarked. Dad gave a sigh and then an apologetic look towards me before saying, We can argue about my faults later. Their expertise could be useful for determining what we are dealing with. Without another word, he led them toward the next room where we had sealed off both Hallett and the original corpse. It occurred to me that since the doctor's untimely death, I hadn't actually come back to check and see if these spores were continuing to spread. As we activated the exterior lights to give us a good look at the makeshift infirmary, I found myself shivering uncomfortably. My word, one of these soldiers whispered, as we peered into the hell that was being created on the other side of the glass. In just the short period of time that we had been gone, the virus had spread all across his body. In fact, it had caused growths of the strange fleshy web-like pattern to branch out and connect to the mummy only a few feet away. Was it developing into a new type of organism? Just seeing the strange mess of flesh writhing and heaving like it had a set of lungs was enough to send shivers down my spine. We had no idea what we were dealing with, and it was getting worse, I realized. How many hours had it been since Dr. Hallett became deceased? The colonel asked as he kept his eyes on the hellish new growth. It almost seemed like it was getting larger before our eyes. An hour or two, 3 at the most, I answered as I stared in abject terror. It was impossible for it to have spread so quickly, but I couldn't ignore the evidence right in front of our eyes. At this rate, the entire facility could be compromised by the end of the day, Dad proclaimed. The room is sealed, George asked, checking the vents as well. Before we got a chance to confirm it, he gave a new order. We need to kill this thing before we all are at risk. That is, if none of you aren't already infected and acting as carriers, he decided. For once, he was talking sense. I knew this discovery was monumental, but the risk to civilization was too great. It needed to be stopped here and now. Dad was not too happy with that, and to my surprise, immediately began to get upset. We have to at least gather samples before we make a drastic decision. We don't even know what we're fighting. He pushed up to where the colonel was standing and blocked the way, forcing the military men to look him in the eye. This is the greatest discovery in centuries. The fact that this virus originated in the fungi kingdom, something quite rare I might add, and the DNA aging of even a microscopic portion of the infected flesh could unlock years of research for the scientific community. We may even be able to determine the evolutionary connection between viruses and the fungi, Dad said. I knew where he was coming from, but this was bigger than us now. I pulled him away and said, You have to let them do their job. There will be other samples that we can find in the ice. The mountain is big enough. He pursed his lips, clearly unsatisfied with that response from me, and glared angrily at Ackley and his men. Fine. Then you must at least allow my men to return to their dig. Any further samples we uncover can remain on ice to prevent a spread. Does that sound like a fair deal to you, Colonel? The senior officer nodded reluctantly and then issued a few orders himself. Henson, Albright, get the gear from the crate and bring it here immediately. We're going to torch this entire thing, he growled. About a half hour later, Henson, Albright, and 2 other armed men arrived with flamethrowers as Colonel Accolade instructed me to unseal the room. Truthfully, I had no idea how the fleshy organism would react once exposed to the outside air, so I insisted we all wear biohazard suits brought by Accolade. Some protection is better than the alternative. I had told them as I opened the metallic door wide as the men walked in, with the canisters of liquid flame on their back. I watched from the other side of the glass with bated breath and insisted that Dominic be there to document the entire thing. Even if it's lost to history, we need a record of what happened here so the world knows that we had no other choice, I told him. Legree was too fascinated by the strange morphed fungal virus to ignore me. Slowly, the soldiers approached the writhing body that had once been Howlett and then pointed their nozzles straight at it, eager to end this nightmare. The flames spit out and it seemed like it all happened in slow motion, watching as the rapid-fire weapon blazed against the flesh and started to make it melt. What happened next I have difficulty shaking from memory because it was so horrific. The organism began to move. Suddenly, from the massive flash, one of the corpse's hands reached out and it slashed directly against the front soldier's biohazard suit. In shock, he fell backwards and the flames spewed upwards. A moment later, we were watching as the bizarre faceless, fleshy corpse moved on its own, like a marionette puppet being pushed along as it shambled across the room, flames spreading everywhere. It slammed against the glass where I was standing with the force of a freight train. A blended mass of open wounds peered towards me, and tiny spores pushed their way out of the face of the corpse as it spewed deadly chemicals directly against the thick glass. Were it not for the protection, it would have been directly on my face. And then the reanimated organism slithered and fell backward, crawling like a crab toward the next soldier as he hurried to help Jensen up. Constantly, the wounds that covered the body were opening and closing, sending out more of the spores into the air as Accolade ordered the men to fall back and to kill the dang thing. Dominic was doing his best to capture it all in photograph, but it was all happening so fast. And then it slammed against the glass again, and this time it began to crack. Legree instinctively protected me, and we jumped back as the creature began to push through the breaking glass. This bizarre, otherworldly hiss being heard from every new wound that was opening. "Move, move!" Dominic ordered frantically as the wall of glass finally gave way. A moment later, I was sure that we would be the next infected. And then Colonel Accolade activated another flamethrower and torched the corpse at max strength. We scrambled to take cover as the organism made this whistling scream and flailed onto the floor, unable to avoid the flames. It was digging into the earth like some kind of rabid dog, I realized as the flames melted its flesh fast. It writhed and shrieked a few moments longer as Accolade got closer, making sure the flames licked and burned every part of the organism's form. And then the room fell silent and the undead creature was immobile once again. Accolade wiped sweat from his brow and gave me a serious, stern look. "Call your father over the radio. The deal is off. We can't allow any other samples to come up," he ordered. Despite everything we told Dad, he was not having a discussion about stopping the dig. "This is my site. You came here to keep us under guard, right? Well then why don't you do your frickin' job and I'll do mine," he stubbornly told the colonel. That didn't sit well with Accolade, and the two got into a verbal fighting match. "3 of my men are dead and we have an unprecedented, unidentified enemy organism on our hands. This virus is not something to try to play God with, Professor," he snarled. "And until I get an order from the university, from your superiors, I will continue to dig. It isn't harming anyone if we collect the data and send it to others. The world deserves to know," Dad said. Accolade huffed and gestured towards me. "Your daughter was nearly killed when that corpse attacked. What if we aren't so lucky next time? How much blood do you want on your hands?" Accolade asked. That statement did give my father pause before he got the chance to respond. Norman shouted from across the dig site. "Professor Gamble, we have found a new pocket," the crewmaster shouted. My father stopped his debate and rushed towards the dig site, eager to see. I followed behind, a bit more cautious but also curious. The hole in the ground looked like it went down at least 200 feet or more, but there were clear signs of what had once been an ancient civilization below us. Even with the limited light we had available, I could see small jutting buildings pushing their way out of the earth wall, but none of them appeared to be designed for actual life. Instead, as the crew managed to bring over the other heavy equipment and shine a brighter light on them, it was quickly apparent that what I was looking at were amalgams of crystalline merged together over the years. Frozen together and forgotten, what was hiding under the ice gave me further pause. We could see dozens, if not hundreds of more mummified bodies, and it shook me to reality again as I realized the implications. This was an entire civilization that was sealed away because of a plague. They were all infected. And we had just discovered the mass grave where they had sacrificed themselves to prevent its spread. As a scientist, there are moments in my life I can look back and feel a swell of pride telling me that I did the right thing for the right reasons. My time in the Andes is not one of them. As I think back to those dark days covered in ice and snow, and I remember what we found there, all I have is a heart full of regret. Accolade insisted we contact the university immediately for authority to destroy the entire catacomb that we had found. Their response, however, was not what any of us had expected. "The site needs to be completely excavated. The historic value outweighs everything else. After all, it's still frozen, correct? As long as there is no change in temperature, there should be no threat," the headmaster insisted. I couldn't believe the audacity they had to think this would be safe. None of them took this seriously or saw the danger. It was merely a discovery for them. Unfortunately, now that they had orders, I knew Ackley and his crew would follow through, so my only option was to attempt to cause as much trouble for them as possible. And so I went to Norman. The foreman had been drinking since Miguel's death, hardly speaking to anyone or leaving his room. And given that we might all be facing similar deaths too, I could hardly blame him. The bizarre life form we had uncovered was growing by the hour, and now we had no one to try to stop it. No one except each other. "What you're asking to do would be considered treason, you know that, right?" Norman asked once I laid the plan out to him. In short, I knew that the digging crew had brought explosives that were meant to blast through more difficult parts of the rock. But that same explosion could also prevent them from ever being able to go any further. It was a risky gamble, especially because it could mean that more people might lose their life. I truthfully didn't know for sure what way Norman was going to swing, but after a few difficult seconds of silence, he drank the last of the whiskey and tossed it down on the cold floor. "Whatever. I would rather die here than for the whole world to be infested with whatever the hell this is," he decided. "Get as many of your men together. We'll start in the middle of the day tonight, alright?" I told him. He promised not to speak a word of it to anyone else, and I went to my next obstacle, my father. So far, he had been quiet since General Accolay's arrival, but I could see that he was equally concerned. I needed him on my side if this had a rat's chance of actually working, though. I tapped on his room door and saw that he was looking at an old family photo, one that included my mother, and he smiled at me in surprise. "Abby, I'm sorry. I guess I should be out there with the others getting everything ready." "It's fine. Ackley and his men have it all sorted out," I said as I came in and sat down beside him. "I wish you were still here," he said, his eyes getting misty. "What do you think she would do?" I whispered back to him. He shrugged, placing the photograph down and looking at me. "I know she would be proud of the woman you have become. This expedition has shown me how strong you are." I smiled, my stomach inwardly twisting as I realized how implicitly he trusted me. "Dad, this is bigger than we expected. I think we're in over our heads, I said softly. Maybe, but it's out of our hands, he admitted. I bit my lip and shook my head. Not yet. I think we can still make a difference, but I may need your help. Abby, I know you will do what you think is right. I know there is much you want to say, but I'm tired. Let's wait until the morning after the next dig, he commented. I let out a sigh, not wanting to argue. We had too much at stake to do that. Instead, I gave him a hug and went to my own quarters across the hall, trying not to think about what would happen in the morning. It wasn't a pretty picture no matter how I painted it, but it would have to be done. Sleep somehow found its way into my weary brain and got me through the cold night. I occasionally heard my dad make soft wheezy noises which frightened me to no end. So the first thing I did when I woke up was to check on him for any signs of infection. It's just old age, he insisted as we traveled down to the dig site. Already, Accolade and his armed men were moving towards the mass grave that we had come across, eager to go deeper into this hell. None of these soldiers showed any signs of wavering against their commander, but then again, I wasn't expecting them to. They would follow him into hell itself if necessary. I thought as I saw Norman and his remaining crew arrive with their equipment. Norman gave me the slightest of nods, giving a soft reassurance that his men were on my side. But I was still on pins and needles as they got started, and I reached for my dad's hand, wondering how things would play out. I didn't have to wonder for very long. Dad pulled his hand away and stepped towards the general. At first I was confused, and then I saw that stoic look he always gives when he wanted to lecture. My heart sank. Dad, what are you doing? I said. General, I'm not quite sure what my daughter is planning, but I believe that she means to sabotage this operation, he said. Accolade immediately ordered two of his men to take me aside. I almost considered fighting them, but Accolade took a look and told me he wouldn't flinch to put a bullet in me. Dad, don't do this! I begged him, but my father had a resolute look that told me that he couldn't be listened to. A moment later, the armed soldiers started towards the crewmen, forcing them to turn on the equipment. Any false moves made will be considered your death sentence, the general said sternly as he gave out orders. I watched as the massive drills poured through the ice, eager to conjure up more evil. Had they learned nothing from the past 48 hours? I shouted, trying to get Norman's attention as the drill went deeper. As I started to see dark liquid slime pour up from between the cracks, it wasn't oil. It was moving the way the corpse had. How deep to the next pocket? Accolade shouted over the crowd. Norman wasn't listening though. He kept drilling. He had this look of determination in his eyes, and then I realized his plan. He knew that he wasn't going to survive. I held my tongue and my breath at the same time as he pressed a sequence on his equipment, and then he closed his eyes. I knew it was coming, but the detonation was deafening. A few of these soldiers were thrown back by the impact, but it was the ones nearest to the blast that faced a real horror. From the impact side, I saw what looked like more of these strange fungus emerging. Just barely with enough cohesiveness to be a life form though, scrambling for anything to consume. It was screaming the way a vicious bird of prey might when scooping up a victim. The second detonation just barely buried out the shrieks of the creature as the equipment fell into the hole. I saw Norman's crane fall head first into the pit. It made a gasp, but it was already too late. It was over. Soon, the other heavy machinery followed with him as the cave began to crumble. Accolade shouted orders, telling everybody to fall back. I could see the fungus desperately trying to advance towards us, to infect us and spread. I ran like the devil himself was chasing me. The ground beneath me shook like the ocean as I scrambled to find a way out. The soldiers also screaming and running as the diseased creature burst apart and pushed millions of spores into the air. We barely made it back to the next tunnel in time as the whole ceiling began to fall and I felt my body go numb. This was exactly how Mom died. Was history repeating itself? My life felt chaotic and frozen all in a single moment as the rocks began to surround me. and then I felt a sharp tug. Akale was there, risking everything to save me from the cave-in. At last, we had made it back to the main facility. The rumbling appeared to stop and we took stock of how many of us had survived. Besides myself and Akale, only 3 soldiers and my father still remained. All of them looked like they had just made it by the skin of their teeth too. "Report, are there any injuries?" the general asked. I got up to my feet, grabbing my father and shoving him against the wall. "There will be soon unless he can explain what the hell he was thinking trying to go deeper." I loved my dad, but in that moment, all I felt was blind rage. How could he be this reckless? "Abigail, I only wanted your mother's legacy to be remembered. I didn't want any of this," he muttered. I saw regret in his eyes combined with shock. He was telling me the truth. So I let him go and I turned towards the soldiers. "We need to get out of here before the rest of the chamber collapses." Akale was trying his best not to wince in pain from the blast as he checked his men and then nodded grimly. "The site itself has been severely compromised. Any remaining components of the life form could be so far in the mantle of the earth that it would be difficult to reach. Plus, without the equipment, it would be impossible." I was actually surprised to hear him sound so reasonable. But the losses we had sustained were too great. No matter how amazing the discovery, we simply had to leave. "Let's move to the observation deck. It's the closest to the surface and we should be safe there while we radio for our transport," Akale suggested. His soldiers obeyed, and Dad reluctantly followed. Akale reported that it would be morning when help arrived. The cold air that swept through this observation deck was just another grim reminder of the destruction caused by our disturbing this ancient tomb. My mind was still reeling from everything that had happened below, but there was one last obstacle I needed to overcome before we returned to civilization. I went towards where my dad was staying and heard this strange wheezing, the same kind that I heard when the corpse reanimated. It made me bolt to save him. I knocked on the half-beaten down door that separated my dad and I saw that he had just finished coughing up blood. It made me pale as I rushed to his side and said, "Did you get infected? Let me check you." "Abigail, I'm fine. It's just old age," he insisted as he tried to push me away. I shook my head and insisted that he sit down as I grabbed a first aid kit. "You won't go anywhere until I'm sure you have a clean bill of health," I said. Reluctantly, he agreed, doing his best to stifle another cough. Using a stethoscope, I listened to his lungs and what I heard frightened me. This was worse than I had expected. I pulled back and looked at my father in disgust. "You are sick and you're trying to hide it. Why, is it the virus we found?" He shook his head, trying to hide it. "You don't understand, Abby. This is what your mother would have wanted. This can change the world." I stood up and snapped. "You can't leave here infected. You could kill billions. Just look at what is happening right now in the world. What you're thinking of doing would be genocide. We don't get to dictate what nature has in store for us," he snapped back. I saw fear and frustration in his eyes, and I saw denial. He believed what he was saying, and I knew what I had to do. I wrapped my hands around his throat and pressed him against the wall, tightening. I saw him struggle, but I couldn't risk another nightmare. I cried and wept as I kept pressing my fingers against his windpipe. And then it was over. And in that last moment of his life, I saw spores beginning to push out of his throat, and I knew that I had done the right thing. Standing there in shock as my father's corpse fell to my feet, I gathered my things and made for my room. When the morning sun arrived and Akale told me rescue was here, I left the Andes alone. I do not want to know what we left behind here, or if it will ever be found again, but I pray that it is gone for good. And if you believe in any higher power protecting us, I ask you to do the same.